Welcome to Model Kit Stuff and welcome to my first product review. So this is a first in a series of focus on products videos where we're going to look at some of the products that people commonly use or new products as they come out and bits and pieces like that, and just take a view of them. And in this first one we're going to have a look at Humbrol weathering powders. So as someone who has used pastel chalks for many years for their modelling for weathering purposes, I was a bit reluctant to delve into weathering powders initially, but eventually curiosity got the better of me, and now I quite enjoy using them, and I find a place for weathering powders alongside my pastels, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go. But let's start with the product. The product is available in many online or bricks and mortar model shops, and of course directly off the Airfix or Humbrol websites. The standard product comes in this 45 milliliter plastic container. You can see it's quite a nice little container, actually, handy when you've finished with it for mixing paint or storing small parts. But they have recently started doing some multi-packs of weathering powders, and they come in 9mm bottles, so you get typically 6 different powders but in a smaller container. So if you want to dip your toe in, that might be a way. I think at the moment they have a weathering powders pack and an aging powders pack, but yeah, they also sell them individually, which is how I've got into them. So I think currently the full range of Humbrol weathering powders is 9 different powders. I have just these 5. These are the ones that I think that I will use with the sort of modelling that I do. So let's have a look at that. So it tells you on the lid what the weathering powder colour is. This one is smoke. And this is great for doing things like dirty streaking effects, or a little bit of exhaust dust or that type of thing. So that's a nice colour for that. Dark earth goes without saying. This helps you do muddy and dusty type weathering. Sand, same again, for anything that you want a little bit sandy. We used this on the tropical Hawker hurricane recently. Then I have light rust, which is quite a nice colour actually, and comes in handy for another number of things other than just rust. And then I have white, and you might wonder why you want a white weathering powder. Well, the main reason I have white is it allows me to change the colours of all of these. I can lighten these using white, in the same way as I can darken some of these using brown. So if I want a dark sandy effect, I can mix 2 together. Or if I want a more orangey sand, I can mix those 2 together. So you get the idea. You can mix the powders and make some bespoke colours yourself. Now it's interesting to point out that Humbrol call these weathering powders. Other companies call them pigments. And these are actually, I think, really good value. These will typically cost you in the UK around about £6 for a pot. And the pot's going to last you a very long time. We're talking a number of years. To put that into comparison, if you were to buy Abteilung 502 pigments, they will typically cost you in the UK around about £4.50, or fractionally less, for a pot that's only 20 millilitres as opposed to 45 millilitres. So typically these Humbrol weathering powders are a lot cheaper, but they don't of course have as wide a range of colours as many of the other companies making powders or pigments. It's all the same thing, just a different way of describing it. So if we take a look in a pot, so we'll open this smoke, you can see that what you get in there is basically a finely ground powder. And that powder can then be taken out of the pot and put into various different containers for you to apply. So let's have a look at how this works. So I find these little paint stirrers quite handy for decanting weathering powder, because you can take an amount in the spoon end of it, and it's nice and mess free. Also, you'll notice that I'm using a blister pack for tablets. This is a good way of handling very small quantities. There's a tendency, if you put it in a pallet or something like that, that you end up using more and therefore wasting more, because it looks like you don't have much. But in these, looks like you've got quite a bit in there. So that's my first little tip. These little disposable things can be quite handy when it comes to weathering powders. They contain the powder quite well. Now, there's typically two different ways of applying a weathering powder, and I'm going to show you a third as well, which I prefer, and I'll explain why. Now, the first way of applying weathering powders, and I use it quite a bit, is just simply as it is with a brush. And I have a number of different dedicated weathering brushes. They all do slightly different jobs and effects for various reasons, but we'll just use this sort of fairly standard brush that's not been altered in any way. And all we do is dab the brush into the weathering powder, and then the weathering powder can be applied straight onto the model to give a dusty effect or a streaking effect. You can see how you can streak that down, and it immediately looks like what you're trying to achieve. And of course you can just simply remove it. And that is the one downside of using it just dry as a powder straight on top without anything else. You can, when you're handling it, remove it. But it is a good way of doing some tonal differences or some staining, rain streaks, whatever you want to do. So as long as you use the right brush and the right tool, you can apply weathering powder dry like that and add all sorts of effects to your model. Now, the other common way of applying a weathering powder is to mix your powder with some varnish. And that can give you all sorts of effects. So if you use a gloss varnish, for example, and a dark earth powder, you can have an effect that looks like wet mud to a certain degree. But mixing varnish with your weathering powder then basically creates some form of paste, and depending on your ratio of varnish to powder depends on how thick it is. But you can then apply that to your model, and you've created basically a paint and that can be used for all sorts of things, whether it be oil staining or dirty puddles, or you want to create a particular colour for doing like panel lines and that sort of stuff. Absolutely doable. I do it quite a lot in things like tyres, for dirt in your tyres, and obviously when that dries, it dries permanent. So you can put it on, you can manipulate it, you can get it to where you want, and then let it dry, and you've got a permanent weathering effect that you've created with your powder. Now, most of the time when you're using weathering powders, when you've finished what it is you're doing, you're actually looking for a matte effect. So although you can use a gloss varnish and have a glossy effect, most of the time you actually want matte, and you're using a matte varnish. So I'm now going to show you a method that I prefer to use for mixing weathering powders, but it only works when you want a matte effect. But like I say, that's most of the time in my experience. And instead of using a matte varnish, I'm going to use decal softener. I bought this because you can get a large bottle of it, and this is basically the product that I use for my weathering powders, just because I can buy it in such a big volume, and I use it quite a bit, so that's really handy. So if you use decal softener, such as Decal Fix, it works in exactly the same way as I've just shown you with a varnish, but it has one really big advantage over varnish, and that is that when you've applied it and left it to dry, if you're not happy with it, you can go back in with some of your decal softener and reactivate it and move it around again. It's sort of semi-permanent, and that gives you the ability to correct mistakes or change your idea, or if you don't like the effect, remove it completely. So it works exactly the same way. You can see my ratio is slightly different than it was with the varnish, but it works in exactly the same way. You can put that powder on, get it where you want, leave it to dry, and in the same way as with removing an oil wash, you can then go in with a clean brush with just some decal softener on and clean up any weathering powder that you don't want, and manipulate it to your heart's content. And you can see what we've done here is we've put that on, we're letting it settle where it wants. You generally, when you're using Decal Fix, have got a little bit longer to manipulate it than you have with varnish, and then once it's dry, you can do what you need to do with it. So I think that's a really good tip when it comes to using weathering powders. Have an experiment like I'm doing here on a sacrificial model, and just try it with your decal softener and see how you get on with your pigments, because it might react differently with different pigments, but certainly with this Humbrol stuff, it works an absolute dream. So we can see that our weathering powder has now dried on, and you've got two options at this point. You can either apply more on top to get the effect you want, or as I was saying, you can use your decal softening solution. I've got clean Decal Fix on this brush, and you can use that to move around and reactivate your weathering powder as you like. So you can change what you've done, you can clear it off the panel, you can see there, completely removing it. So for me, that's a great way of working with weathering powders. So if you've not tried it, give it a go. Instead of using a varnish, use your decal softener on your weathering powders and pigments, and you might find that gives you a much more flexible way of working. So before weathering powders and pigments, I always used to use pastels, and the basic idea is that you scrape them with a knife, and you create a powder, and you can use them in the same way as a weathering powder. And there's a huge range of colours you can buy, and you can buy these things individually. So that's what I've always done. The advantage of buying pots of weathering powder over these, really the only advantage is ease of storage. I mean, that's my set of pastels, and they get a bit mucky. Now probably I could do with storing them better, but I don't have a way of storing them. Some of them you can buy in sets and keep in the box, but they're a bit mucky to use. But I still love my pastels, and that is as good a way of weathering as weathering powders. But if you want to go into weathering powders, then for me, the Humbrol ones are just as good as any. At the end of the day, they all work in the same way. So as long as you've got the ability in your mind to create the colours that you would want from the colours available, remembering that you can mix them and make your own. These are great value for money compared to a lot of other brands. I think the pots that they come in are easy to use because you've got a nice wide neck, whereas quite a lot of the other ones come in smaller, almost like paint jars, and then it's not as easy to get in and out, and readily available. So far, since Humbrol launched these, there hasn't been a time other than initially when they first came out where they've been out of stock. Whereas with others, they seem to sort of come into stock and then they're gone for months at a time. So personally, I prefer to use one system when it comes to weathering powders, so that I know that I can mix them with confidence, and I know that any products that I might be using with them will work with all of them, and it just makes life a bit more simple. That's just the way I work. So Humbrol weathering powders, I've used all of these now, and I'm very happy with them. They do a great job, easy to apply, but also consider pastels if you want to look at weathering powders. Now I will do another video just on pastels at some point, but there you have it. That is Humbrol weathering powders. I hope that was informative in some way, gives you the basics and gives you my view. I think it's a great little product if you're in the market for some weathering powders or pigments. Okay, hope that was helpful. Take care everyone, enjoy your modelling, and I will see you very soon.